Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. What do you drink when you fly? Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. My name is Simon, and you are joining me in the studio today for our May Newsworthy Clips article. Now, a Newsworthy Clips article actually includes a number of smaller articles, and so today's lesson is actually called Is Airline Water Safe? And that's a pretty clear title. It tells you exactly what we're talking about today, the possible risk that you might find yourself in if you are drinking water in an airplane. Joining me in the studio today, I have two panelists. First, we have Manya, who has all kinds of experience flying.
Oh, yes. I've flown many times before, so I am aware of airline water.
And Manya, to answer the question we asked in the introduction, what do you drink when you're on an airplane?
I tend to go for ginger ale.
Oh.
I just really like ginger ale, especially on an airplane.
My goodness, that's a fancy drink. You
It
must not
is.
be flying the discount airlines.
They always have ginger ale, Simon. Next time, you should ask for it.
I'm going to have to check that out. Our other panelist today is Josh. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you, Simon. It's good to be back.
You are also an experienced traveler, but you tend to, backpack and do adventure travel.
I do adventure travel, and I also like to travel on a budget, which means sometimes I do go for the discount airlines. And on those airlines, you have to pay for everything that you drink. So in those cases, I do not drink anything that the airlines give me. But when I do get free beverages, I will usually have a very set sort of regimen of hydration. So that is a way of keeping myself hydrated or keeping enough water in my system. And that will be club soda or soda water, the Virgin Bloody Mary mix, which is tomato juice with a little bit of spices in it. And usually I will try and do an orange juice or some sort of fruit juice, as well as a coffee or a tea.
You have really thought this out, Josh. I'm very impressed. I was expecting one of you just to say coffee, or something like that. It's interesting that this is an issue at all in this day and age. And of course, that is largely the result of changes that have happened since 9/11 in the United States. Because, of course, in the old days, you could just bring your own bottle of water or whatever onto the airplane. But now, of course, you have to get rid of your water, your drinks, before you go through security. And that creates a bit of a problem. In some airports, once you're in the airport, you have to spend a lot of money if you want to buy bottled water. And so it leaves people feeling a little parched. And that's a word that is a good way of describing thirsty. When people feel parched, it means they feel very dry. And that, I guess, is more of a problem now on airplanes than it was in the past. Do you remember the days before you were not allowed to bring water?
I can't recall.
I do.
Too young.
Yeah, I do.
But Josh, we are now, our audience knows exactly how old we are. We remember before 2001.
I remember back in the old days when airlines used to also include real silverware.
Oh, I remember that too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it became dangerous.
And then it became dangerous, that's
right. So now we have this situation on airlines, I guess, when you are getting in the airport, but before you're in the plane. Some airports have water machines and things like that allow you to fill a water bottle. Otherwise, you get into the plane and you basically are waiting for people to provide service. They come around with the cart, they offer you drinks, and that leaves you with a limited selection of choices. Sometimes there are some alcoholic drinks. There's often bottled water, soda, and usually coffee and tea, especially after you eat a meal. But sometimes people are thirsty at other times. And so here, what we're really talking about when we talk about airline water is not those drinks that come from the cart that are in sealed containers. We're talking here about water that's kept in tanks on the plane. So, for example, the tap water you might find in the bathroom. Now, let's find out a little more about this. In our first section, we're going to find about a research study that's been done fairly recently. And so, listeners, you can join us on page 28 of your May Advanced Magazine. We're going to read the first section at the top of the left-hand column. Let's do that now.
Is airline water safe? A new study came to a surprising conclusion about the one thing you should never consume on a commercial airliner. Their counterintuitive advice? Never drink tap water, coffee, or tea on a commercial airplane. It's counterintuitive simply because dehydration is a big issue for many airline passengers. But the study authors at Hunter College NYC Food Policy Center and DietDetective.com say their concern is that the tanks in which airline water is stored could be contaminated with harmful bacteria.
Okay, so straight away in the first sentence, we find out that there's a new study and it has come to a surprising conclusion. Now, what is that conclusion, Josh?
Well, the conclusion is that you shouldn't drink water on an airplane.
Yeah, they use some interesting language to present that to us. They say you should never consume. And when you consume something, that is a very versatile word. You can use it in a lot of different ways. It means take in or take on something at its basic level. And so we talk about consumers being people who buy things. They are consuming things. But here we're really talking about food and drinks. So the one thing you should never consume on an airline. That's what they've found out. And what is that thing, Josh? You said it was water, right? And so they say here in our next sentence that this is counterintuitive advice. Manya, what exactly is counterintuitive advice?
So counterintuitive is when something happens that's the opposite of your expectation. So when you're on an airplane, you probably think, oh, I should be drinking water because it's so dry up there. And you're probably thirsty when you're in an airplane. But their counterintuitive advice is don't drink water, or tap water, I should say.
Yeah, now the interesting thing about the way they've worded this is it really shows you very clearly that this is a very Western North American news article. Because I think, to be honest, my wife is from here in Asia, and I think most of her family would not think this was counterintuitive at all. Because often in Asian countries and in much of the world, people don't really trust tap water, right? So, for example, we drink hot water or boiled water or tea or things like that. Even if the tap water is safe, there are sort of questions about that. But for people who've grown up in North America, the United States, and Canada, you're very used to just drinking water out of the tap. So we're used to thinking of tap water as being the safe go-to source if you want to drink. Right, Josh?
Usually, yes.
Yeah. Not always.
Not always.
We do have some water scandals.
We do have some water scandals. And I think as, information on the internet becomes easier for people to understand what's happening in other parts of the world, I think it's more common for people to get comfortable with the idea that not all water is safe.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the reason this is counterintuitive, so unexpected advice for North Americans, is that most North Americans would assume that water from the tap is safe to drink. And they're suggesting here that that might not be the case. And so that's actually what they say. They say never drink tap water, but then they continue on with some surprising things on that list, right, Manya? What are the other things on that list?
They also mentioned to not drink coffee or tea.
Now, I think most of our listeners will find this counterintuitive because, here in Taipei, when you don't want to drink tap water, you drink coffee or tea, especially tea, because the water's been boiled and so it's clean, right?
That's right. Although I also have to point out here that in a Western culture, I think most people would look at coffee and tea as counterintuitive for hydration. And the reason why is because there's a lot of information out there that says anything that contains caffeine, like coffee, or maybe black tea, like we would say in English, is not something that you should be drinking to hydrate yourself.
So just quickly to summarize that, they are saying here that it is counterintuitive that you shouldn't drink water, tea, and coffee on an airplane. Now, our writer goes on to say that that's because you're thirsty on an airplane. And so the term they use is dehydrated. There's dehydration. That's a big issue for many people. But we're saying that depending on where you live, this might be counterintuitive or surprising for other reasons. Some people might never think of drinking the tap water. They might just right away go for bottled water. Nonetheless, this is maybe good advice. It depends on how you feel about this study. As we continue on to the third paragraph, it tells us that the authors of this study are from Hunter College in New York City, and they're at a place called the Food Policy Center, and also dietdetective.com. Now, they go on here to explain very specifically why they are concerned. Josh, can you tell us what is it that they're worried about?
So their specific concern is not, like you said, the drinks that they serve in sealed containers, but the tanks in which airline water is stored, and that those tanks could be contaminated with harmful bacteria.
Now, this is not a completely ridiculous thing, of course, whenever you store water in tanks for long periods of time. If you don't clean the tank out from time to time, we use the word flush the system often. It's similar to flushing a toilet, right, where you put new water in it. If you're not doing that with some regularity, then there's a chance that, weird, germy things will happen in the tank. So it's not a completely ridiculous idea. That brings us to our second reading, and this reading deals specifically with the advice that the researchers give us. Listeners, you can find this second reading at the bottom part of the left-hand column on page 28, and we'll continue on until the end of the section about midway down the right-hand column.
Their advice. It's probably best to avoid drinking water from the tap on a plane, which also means staying away from coffee and tea. Even though the EPA has instituted the Aircraft Drinking Water Rule, ADWR, to ensure that safe and reliable drinking water is provided to aircraft passengers and crew. There are a couple of reliable researchers who believe there may be harmful bacteria in airline water. This is probably because the water tanks are not emptied very often. So water is just sitting for long periods of time in what appear to be not so clean tanks. Instead, they advise buying bottled water in the airport, and if you want coffee or tea, asking the flight attendants to heat it up for you. Now, we should mention that just about every airline takes issue with this recommendation, and with the suggestion that they don't clean water tanks often enough.
Okay, and so the simple advice that these researchers give is that it's probably best to avoid drinking water from the tap on a plane. And so that advice, it doesn't seem entirely like bad advice to me. The airline is providing bottled water, right, most of the time. And so that doesn't seem too difficult or unreasonable, though I don't know how much real risk there is. And we'll kind of get into that in our next section, actually, where the airlines respond to this research. But the one that I really found surprising here was this idea that avoiding tap water also means avoiding coffee and tea. Now, what's the thinking behind that?
Well, because when you make coffee and tea, you have to boil the water. And so probably, one might think, oh, it's okay because the water has already been boiled.
That's right, because, even when you're traveling, when you're in places where they say it's not safe to drink the tap water, people are drinking tea all the time because it's been boiled and it's been made clean. Now, it's interesting because this study here, we have a little sidebar at the bottom of the right-hand column that says this is not the first study to point out that there's this possible risk with tap water on planes. It says this isn't the first study to make the exact same recommendation. And then there's an interesting line. They say, and anecdotally, some airline employees say they'll never drink the water on board. Now, Josh, we were talking before we started the program about something you had heard about flight attendants not wanting to drink the coffee. But you'd heard that there were different reasons for that, not that they were really worried about the safety of the water, right?
Yeah, so anecdotally here means according to stories that other people tell you, sort of in an informal setting as opposed to like a formal research. But I had also seen, like Simon said, some reports of stewardesses or flight attendants talking about how they would never drink the coffee, not necessarily because they were afraid of the water quality, but because they were afraid of the coffee that came out of the coffee pots, because the coffee pots aren't cleaned as often, which makes them bitter and kind of tasteless.
So it was more an issue of like low quality coffee taste
Exactly.
than a concern about safety. But nonetheless, there's enough discussion about this that the EPA, now this is the American EPA, Manya, can you quickly tell us, what does EPA mean?
EPA means the United States Environmental Protection Agency.
That's right. So they're the government branch in the U.S. that's in charge of making sure the environment is safe for people, sort of protecting the environment. So the EPA has created a rule basically because of this concern. The rule is called the Aircraft Drinking Water Rule. And the idea behind it is that this rule will ensure that safe and reliable drinking water is provided to aircraft, passengers, and crew. So they've come up with a set of guidelines to try to keep this water, I guess you could say, certifiably safe. So we can be sure that this water is safe. But nonetheless, it tells us there are still researchers who have worries and questions about this. And so that brings us to the top of the right-hand column, where it says the reason that these researchers have these concerns. And what is the main concern they have there, Josh?
Well, their main concern is that the water tanks are not emptied very often, so that the water just sort of sits in this tank over a long period of time. And any time when water sits for a long period of time, there is a real possibility that bacteria can grow.
That's right. Now, many of our listeners will not have had experience managing a swimming pool. But a lot of people from the West will have some experience with a pool, and you know that if you are not dumping a lot of chemicals into a pool, then it gets really gross really quickly. And the reason for that, of course, is just the water isn't really moving. One of the words we use to describe water that isn't moving is stagnant. And so if you have water that's maybe going through a filter, but it's really just kind of sitting there, it tends to get pretty gross pretty quickly. And that basically is the concern here, because unlike a swimming pool, you can't just dump buckets and buckets of chemicals like chlorine into the water tank and still have it safe to drink. You don't want to drink pool water, right? And so that's kind of an issue here that people are concerned about. And so they provide some alternative advice. So instead of drinking this tap water on the airplane, what do they say you should do, Manya?
They say you should buy bottled water in the airport before you get on the airplane.
Okay, now, Josh, you are our discount traveler here. Can you point out any problems with this advice?
Well, there are a couple problems with the advice. I think it's not a bad idea if you are able to find a water machine that can fill your water bottle to go ahead and do that and bring it on board. Even if it isn't a discount airline that won't give you complimentary bottled water. But here they suggest that if you want coffee or tea, to ask your flight attendant to heat up that bottled water for you. And that might actually be a problem. It's been in my experience that a lot of the airlines don't have the capability or a small microwave they can use just to heat clients' water.
Well, and moreover, I cannot think of any way to make yourself unpopular with flight attendants faster. You know, when they're trying to serve 200 people and everybody wants their bottle of water boiled for them, even if they were able to do it, right? And so it's kind of a thing that maybe creates inconvenience for people. Basically, we need to find a better long-term solution if there is a real risk here to the airplane water.
That's very true. And I like that, Simon, that you pointed out. The flight attendants have actually a very challenging job, and there are a lot of things that they have to take care of. And keeping them happy really does make it a much better flight experience for everyone.
It's true, isn't it? When you're friends with the flight attendant, the flight goes well. And so, of course, it should be no surprise to us listeners that airlines really like this advice very much. The phrase they use here is they take issue with this recommendation. Now, Manya, when you are taking issue with something, give us a breakdown of what that means.
Basically, it just means you disagree with someone. That means you have an issue with what they have suggested or what they have said.
Often in English, we use this word issues as sort of a gentle way to talk about argument or disagreement, right?
Or problem. We could also say problem.
Problems that people are having. So you might say like, we have issues, meaning we have problems. Our relationship is not very good. And so that's all connected to this phrase where you take issue with something. Just means you point out there is a problem with it. You are unhappy with it. You disagree with this recommendation. And in particular, the airlines, they don't probably want all of this extra work for their staff, but they're also a little sensitive about the suggestion that their airplanes are, dirty and giving people dirty water. They say here specifically, they take issue with the recommendation and with the suggestion that they don't clean water tanks often enough. And so that is the airline's big complaint. And that brings us to our next section, where we're going to hear from the airlines, their response to this idea that there is dirty water on their planes. Listeners, you can join us again on page 28 at the bottom of the right-hand column for the section under the title, Among the Responses Included in the Report.
Among the responses included in the report, Delta Airlines. In compliance with regulation, the team disinfects the tank system on every aircraft 4 times a year, performs water quality sampling once per year, and enters this data into EPA's Aircraft Reporting and Compliance System. Air Canada. Air Canada samples every aircraft 4 times per year, in addition to the random testing conducted monthly by Health Canada. United Airlines. We utilize a vigorous program that complies with federal EPA regulations. In addition to the disinfection program, United monitors water quality by testing samples at EPA-approved laboratories. Every single plane in the fleet is tested annually. You can see each airline's longer response in greater detail at Diet Detective.
Now, listeners, I am not always a huge fan of big airlines, but I think here, in their defense, we need to have a little bit of context, because as we read these responses, one of the things that jumps out right away is the numbers. Like, they say things like, we check it 4 times a year, we check it every year, and if you are a person who is worried about dirty water, your response is going to be, that's not very often. Like, all kinds of bad things can happen in 3 months, right? But to place that in a little bit of context, I think, again, we need to underline or mention again this idea that in North America, because this is an American article, we generally feel confident about drinking tap water. And so, for example, at my parents' house in Canada, they use a well. They have their own water system, and it is tested twice a year. So twice a year, they are sent this cup in the mail. It's like a sealed cup. They have to open it up, fill it with water, and then they have a period of time to drive it to the nearest hospital lab. And they drop it off in this little iced container, and then it's tested for them, and then it comes back whether or not they need to treat their water or information. But that happens twice a year, and it's a system that really does not lead to too many problems. You don't hear about people getting really sick from drinking their tap water unless there's been a big scandal, and there have been a few of those over the years. But nonetheless, regular tap water that people drink without thinking about too much at all the time isn't necessarily tested as much as this airline water is tested.
That's very true. Although I find it interesting that, so is someone from the government sending this cup to your family saying you must test twice a year because you have a private well?
It's kind of voluntary, because I don't think the police come to get you if you don't fill your cup. But, you want to know that you're your drinking water is safe, right? So it's like when you're heading into the nearest town or whatever. My parents kind of live in the countryside. You just fill up the cup, you go in, you drop it off at the hospital.
Very interesting. But yes, I would say the assumption for most people living in North America is that the tap water or the city water or municipal water is going to be safe when it comes out of the tap.
Yeah. And so here, the response that you get over and over again from the airlines is that they are in compliance with the rules. They are following the rules, doing everything they're required to do. And that's actually the phrase you get from Delta Airlines. They disinfect their tank, meaning they clean out the tank on the aircraft 4 times a year. They perform water quality sampling. That's like my parents do with their well, once per year. So they do it, half as often as my parents do. But nonetheless, they enter all of the information into this reporting system. Air Canada, an example from Canada, they sample all of their aircraft 4 times a year, and then they are also randomly tested each month. Different aircraft will be tested by Health Canada. Now, United Airlines, Manya, can you tell us what do they say they do?
Well, they have the disinfection program. And so what that means is the United Airlines, they monitor the air quality by testing the samples.
Okay, and so again, they utilize this vigorous program, meaning they have or they use a program that is, vigorous basically means there's a lot of attention to detail here, and they're very focused on making sure that it's working. And then, of course, they disinfect again, just like Delta Airlines did, and they test their samples in laboratories. And every plane is tested. So each airline gives a longer response than this actually, but you have to go to the website to find it. So basically, in this article that we are talking about today, you have people pointing out that there's a potential for risk, and then other people saying, yeah, there's always potential, but, we do a lot of work to make sure it's safe. So for you listeners, as you are flying on airplanes, what advice do we have, panel?
Well, for me, I would say, get yourself a soda or something in a can. That way you don't have to worry about it.
So if you're worried about it, just drink the bottled water. If you really need some coffee because your baby is screaming and you've been up for a long time, drink the coffee even though it tastes bad. And don't worry too much. We really don't hear big news stories about hundreds of people getting sick from the tea on airplanes very often.
That's
so
true. Maybe
something to be aware of, but not something to worry about too much. That brings us to the end of our first day of our newsworthy clips for the month of May. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow as we talk about quantum computing. Until then, this is Simon.
I'm Manya.
And I'm Josh.
Saying bye for now.
Goodbye.